Good morning, Dr. Corrali. Good. Ms. Harris.
Good morning, Chair. This morning, the inquiry will be hearing again from Dr. Corrali, and this time he will speak to his second witness statement. Dr. Corrali's second witness statement is in a response to a request sent by the inquiry for an overview of the inpatient pathway and for certain key features of that pathway. The evidence will deal in a broad sense with matters from admission to discharge, and it will touch on specific issues, for example, admission assessments, medication, restrictive practices, involvement of family, and so on. This afternoon, a member of the Counsel to the Inquiry team will present 3 short summaries to you covering other evidence that the inquiry has received so far. Those summaries will cover the evidence received so far from NHS England, from the Department of Health and Social Care, and from mental health charities. There may be aspects of today's evidence that are difficult to listen to. For some people, it may not be possible to sit through the 2 sessions. And as with other days, anyone in the inquiry room should feel free to leave at any time. May I take this opportunity again to remind those engaging with the inquiry that emotional support is available for all who require it. The well-being of those participating in the inquiry is extremely important to the inquiry. We have present here again today emotional support staff from Hestia, an experienced provider of emotional support at these types of hearings, and I think they're currently in the room. They can be identified by their orange-coloured scarves. There is a private room here where anyone who needs emotional support can talk to the Hestia support staff, or if you prefer, you can speak to a member of the inquiry team and we'll put you in touch with the emotional support staff. We are all wearing purple-coloured lanyards. For those following this hearing online, information about the emotional support that is available can be found on the Lampard Inquiry website at lampardinquiry.org.uk, and the support tab is near the top right-hand corner. We want everyone engaging with this inquiry in whatever way to feel safe and supported. Chair, I will now turn to questions of Dr. Corrali, who you see is at the witness table waiting. He is still under oath from yesterday and therefore does not need to be sworn again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Corrali, you are still under oath and remain under oath, having been sworn in yesterday. I won't go through all the preliminaries again, therefore, but can you just state your full name again for the record, please?
Milind Ramakrishna Corrali.
We won't go through your roles and responsibilities again as you provided them yesterday, and they are also set out within your second witness statement in addition.
That's right.
We also heard yesterday that you're a consultant psychiatrist, although your role is much more now a managerial one.
That's correct.
We also know that you have been working with the Trust and its predecessor since 2012.
That's correct.
And you have remained with EPUT after the merger of SEPT and NEPT in 2017.
That's correct.
You provided a second witness statement on behalf of EPUT in response to a request for evidence from the inquiry.
That's right.
And for those following by way of electronic documentation, that statement begins at page 1096 of the core bundle provided for this hearing, disclosed for this hearing. Do you have a copy of that statement in front of you?
I do.
It's dated the 26th of March 2025. Is that right?
Yeah.
It is 127 pages long.
That's correct.
I think it contains some 594 paragraphs. If we turn to the last page of the statement, which for the record is page 1222 of the core bundle, we can see you made a statement of truth and you signed the witness statement.
That's correct.
I think there may be 2 or 3 minor corrections you've indicated you may wish to make to that statement. Can I deal with it this way? Please identify those when we go through the evidence and identify where they are, and we can correct the record accordingly. If we don't touch on them, I will ask you to remind me at the end, and we'll ensure that your statement is as you wish it to be before it is published.
Thank you.
Subject to those alterations that may be made, do you ask that this statement be taken as your evidence to the inquiry at this stage?
Yes.
Further to the evidence that you confirmed and provided yesterday?
Yes.
And for the record, that statement will form part of the material for the inquiry's consideration. You also provided multiple exhibits.
That's correct.
With this statement, over 200 in fact.
That's correct.
And the documents which you provided, you rely upon to support or illustrate points that you made in your witness statement? Yes?
That's correct.
Or in order to respond to the request for documentation, which I will come to in a moment.
That's correct.
By way of background, again, you'll recall, and we said yesterday, that on Thursday the inquiry heard expert evidence from Dr. Davidson and Maria Nellican about standards of practice in mental health care and some of the challenges in delivery of that care. My aim today is to ask you about the practice of EPUT and its predecessors in delivering inpatient care and treatment to Essex patients over the relevant period. And again, by way of introduction, this is an introductory hearing. I'm not going to be asking you about specific failings in care. You have not been, and I'll come back to this in a moment, for example, asked to produce data on where services fell short or anything of that nature for this statement. That's right, isn't it?
Yep. Yes.
You were asked to provide a description of the mental health treatment and care that the Trust delivered.
That's correct.
Yes. Identification of the key policy or documentation that underpinned the service.
That's correct.
An explanation of how the Trust monitored and evaluated performance.
That's correct.
And I'll come back to that in a moment, as in how you checked whether the service was being delivered as intended. And you were asked to provide an overview of the records that would exist to show the outcome of that monitoring and evaluation.
That's correct.
In short, the inquiry asked for a broad explanation of the systems and processes involved.
That's correct.
I'm going to begin by asking you asking some general questions. Like yesterday, when we go through your evidence, please can you make clear as appropriate when you are describing something that should have happened as opposed to something that actually happened to your knowledge?
Yes.
As in, can we try and identify today where things described are aspirational or maybe described as aspirational? At paragraph 8 of your witness statement, you say this: while I've done my best in the time available... Sorry.
I was just trying to say things should happen, and that is what's rather than aspirational, and certain things haven't happened. That's something that's different. So there are some standards or expectations of an organization that doesn't happen is different to aspirations. So just want to make sure that distinction.
Thank you. When we get to various paragraphs in your witness statement, I will ask you to make clear whether that's something that you say should be happening or something that you know was happening in practice.
That's right. Thank you.
All right. I was just, I hope, picking up from what you said yesterday, reminding you that in this statement, you've also said at paragraph 8 that you've done your best to address the issues, but there are others who might be better placed to provide more detail concerning the pre-EPUT period.
That's correct.
Would you accept as a general point that your statement, and this may be the reason, is relatively limited in description of what I might call historical matters, matters that happened in the earlier part of the relevant period?
That's correct.
And it's largely focused, I think, on the current position and the forward-looking position of
That's
EPUT.
correct.
And in fact, it's right that many of the documents you've provided are policies and exhibits which are recently produced, 2023, 2024, and I think even 2025.
That's correct.
In places, I'm going to ask you to provide greater clarity about certain measures, but if you cannot provide answers today, would you undertake to return at a later date to provide that information?
I would.
can I ask you about the policies, EPUT's policy library, for want of a better expression, and access to policy? Just using some examples before we get to the body of your statement, I'd like to ask you about some of the documents you've provided. Now, the inquiry understands that what you've provided is what might be called a corporate statement. You've made it on behalf of EPUT. But the inquiry would like to understand how various documents were selected and how the Trust approached the task of identifying what was selected and provided to the inquiry to use for the statement and to attach to it. So can I ask you about one or two? At paragraph 262 in your statement, and this is just focusing on the documentation, you produce a version of the safety management procedure, which is exhibit MK2148. Could we put that up, please? So there might be a slight delay. There we go. I'm not sure if we can see the top of the page. Oh, I can't see that. We can see, now I appreciate this is a procedure, that the clinical risk assessment and safety management procedure, if we look at the review date, or we look at the implementation date was the 1st of July, the last review date was the 17th of March 2017, with the next review date being October 2019. I'm not going, but I will actually. In your statement for yesterday, you produced MK15. Can I ask that that be put up, please? I appreciate there may be a slight delay as we change bundles. This is the clinical risk assessment and management policy. I appreciate that we looked at a procedure for this is the policy, and this one has a last review date of the 14th of February 2025 and a next review date of December. The question I'm asking you, sorry to be complicated in arriving at it, is does this document not replace or supersede, or this set of documents replace the documents from 2017 to be reviewed in 2019?
If it's the same policy, then it should supersede the previous policy.
I appreciate that this, as I say, is a policy and the other one was a procedure. The two usually come together, don't they? But it looks like there is a more recent version of MK2148 that we haven't got.
Chair, I've relied on the organisation to provide these exhibits. I will go back to the organisation and see whether those documents, if they are there, could be provided to the inquiry team.
Another question I wanted to ask you about was whether or not documents have been provided in draft form. Can you help us with this? If we look at your statement at paragraph 56H, and I'm not asking you about the evidence per se, but I'll put it into context. You're talking about medical assessment and clerking and what it will include. And at H, you say it will include to agree an initial engagement and observation plan with the patient. Do you see that at 56H?
Yes,
I think we've now got it up. Thank you very much, Amanda. And you produce in that regard MK224 and MK225, which relate to the electronic systems. Can we just have a brief look at those, please? I think 24 is at our exhibits bundle at 1075. There is MK24. Do you see in the parent policy clinical guideline there are some X's, and in the ratification groups there are some X's? Is this in draft form, do you think?
It's likely to be in the draft form.
Yeah. Can we have a look, please, at MK25 as well, which is at 1087 of the same bundle? I think this is even more apparently in draft form. This is MK25. Putting aside the document and what it's about for a moment, we can see the X's and we've got highlight and add date, even though the approval group committee date on, I think on both of the front pages of these documents is the 23rd of November 2023. And that looks to be a draft document as well, doesn't it?
It does.
Can you help us? Have these documents come out of draft form? Have they been ratified or implemented?
So it's my understanding is that so it's first the trust is trying to get a number of these documents on an electronic platform called Sophia, and they're in the process of moving a number of these documents so that they're easily accessible to staff. I also understand that until a new policy has been ratified, the previous policy, even if it's out of date, continues to be the current policy for the procedure for the clinicians.
Well, can I just ask you about that? Because you've mentioned staff, because obviously the importance of this documentation is that staff can access it and see what it says and how they need to conduct their practice. So at the moment, you're saying that these appear to be on the system in draft form. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes.
And so how would staff know what they're looking for or looking at? Would they find this, or would they find the old version?
So if when staff want to access a policy, there is on the Trust intranet a section for policies and procedures, and they would go on that website and type whatever policy they are wanting to. If they want to know about disengagement, that's the word they would, and the relevant policy will come up. They'd follow that policy.
If they were looking for this, what would they get? Would they get the draft form here, or would they get the old version?
I'm not certain from where this policy is being obtained, whether it's from the intranet or.
But you acknowledge, do you, and accept that the inquiry appears to have been provided with draft documents in support of your statement?
Yes.
There are other examples which I won't go to, but I think one of them was in relation to Larkwood, but there are a number, I think, within the bundle. As we've already outlined, in the Rule 9 request, the inquiry specifically sought copies of current policies and relevant documentation, and for a comprehensive list of all the relevant documents from the relevant period, with changes identified. Now, I appreciate what you have written, I think, at your paragraph 8 about timing, but do you think it will be possible for EPUT to provide this comprehensive list of documentation to the inquiry at some point?
Chair, I'll have to go back to the organisation. I'm probably not best placed to give an idea about the policies and procedures and the documents.
And you'd be able to let us know what staff would actually see if they went onto the inquiry?
Chair.
Thank you.
Really, as I said in my preamble to this section, the inquiry, I think, needs to understand the state of EPUT's library. and
Yes.
what it looks like. Can I just, on that note, make reference to monitoring and compliance? We touched on this yesterday. In the Rule 9 requests that were sent in relation to both pre-admission assessments and the inpatient pathway, EPUT was asked to explain, in relation to various aspects, in fact all of the components, how it evaluated and monitored practice and compliance. You recall that request? You're nodding. I think for the transcript
Yes,
you have to say yes. Thank you. The Trust was also, as you say, asked to identify the documents and records that formed that monitoring and evaluation. Now, for the record, you give that matter some attention at paragraphs 205 to 213 of your first statement and at 400 to 409 of your second statement. But the response is limited. Again, for the record, as you know, this is an area of particular interest to the inquiry and its participants. And it's going to be important for the inquiry to obtain a systematic and comprehensive explanation of how practice was monitored throughout the period and an understanding of the records that exist for that monitoring, which what is available for the inquiry's scrutiny in effect. So therefore, given the limited response in your statements, the inquiry will send further requests for fuller and better information. Do you agree, or can you agree on behalf of EPUT, that additional information will be provided in due course when requested on this topic, on monitoring and evaluation?
Yes, Chair, I'm not probably the best person around the monitoring and the governance arrangements of the organisation, but I would take it back to the organisation.
I was going to ask if you would undertake to return to give evidence on the matter, but I think what you're saying is that EPUT may need to identify someone better placed to give evidence about monitoring and evaluation than you in your role. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
All right. Can I move then on to pathway and begin with pre-admission and the urgent care pathway? Now, I'm not going to go back over what we heard yesterday. We've already heard evidence about pre-admission assessments, but I think you picked this up at your paragraph 44 of your witness statement. At 44, you say, inpatient admissions into EPUT services do not follow a single point of entry, and the processes vary across the specialities as outlined individually within the statement. However, a common principle across all of the services is that some form of assessment is undertaken prior to admission. The assessment includes a review of their records where possible, to gather information from any prior assessments and care plans, and to identify any advanced choices, patients' wishes, wherever possible, should be considered when determining whether hospital admission is appropriate, including admissions under the Mental Health Care Act. And I think if we then need to jump ahead to your paragraph 526, where you are dealing with adults and older adults, and you say for informal admissions, patients will be assessed by the clinical teams in the community and a decision made whether enhanced community provision can be offered and whether admission is necessary. If admission is required, appropriate gatekeeping teams in the urgent care pathway, such as crisis resolution home treatment teams, crisis response teams, urgent care department and dementia intensive service teams for patients with dementia frailty, will be contacted. You go on to say at 527, thank you, Amanda, for patients requiring formal admissions under the Mental Health Act, assessments are completed by the local authority approved mental health professionals, the AMPs, and the Section 12 approved doctors. AMPs are mental health professionals who have been approved by local social services authority to carry out certain duties under the MHA. You go on to say how AMP services transferred into the local authority between 2018 and 2019. And there's obviously there a difference between informal and formal. paragraph 528, I think you're still referring to formal admission when a decision is made that a patient requires admission, a request is made for the bed, specifying the type of bed is required, and then you go on to talk about under the Mental Health Act. At paragraph 529, you talk about the urgent care pathway. The urgent care pathway is for crises, and the crisis response team, CRS, provide a 4-hour response. The crisis home team and accident and emergency A&E liaison team have a policy, which you reference, for the 24-hour response. This is currently being reviewed alongside the 3 integrated care boards for the entirety of the urgent care pathway. Can you explain shortly, please, then, in that context, the urgent care pathway and the function of the urgent care department?
The urgent care pathway has evolved over a period of time. It involves the pathway for patients needing inpatient treatment. So these are patients who are in crisis, and there are a number of services which they can access to receive inpatient treatment. So that's the urgent care pathway. The crisis teams are predominantly the main teams initially to bring the patients in, and informal patients were admitted to an assessment unit. The idea was that instead of relying on a single assessment in the middle of the night by a nurse or a trainee doctor, let's bring the patient into an assessment unit where more time can be spent in gathering information. A senior person, a consultant, can make a decision whether the patient should be admitted or should be discharged. And that was the idea of assessment units. We realized with time that once patient stays overnight, there was a tendency to keep these patients for a longer period, and that was in a way blocking and causing some bed pressures. So the idea of can we assess these patients without keeping them overnight, and also to see that patients, our psychiatric patients, don't have to wait in general hospital A&Es for a long period. Their experience is different there. Those are busy A&Es. They often have to wait. Can we provide our own A&E, which is calm, purpose-built, which will cater to the needs of these patients? And that led to the development of urgent care department in Basildon. We've been now asked to build set up 2 more urgent care departments in Essex. So that's the overall sort of urgent care pathway.
You deal at paragraphs 529 and 30 with the response times, the various timing of responses, which is 4 hours for the CRS, 24 hours for the CRHT and liaison, and 24 hours for the urgent care department. Can you explain those response times for those needing assessment, or the rationale for those response times?
So as I mentioned yesterday, the crisis response team will use a tool to decide how urgent the assessment is. And the 4R refers to a particular section B, where you require a response within that specific time. The crisis teams home treatment is for patients who are in the community, and they would ring the patient and arrange an assessment in 24 hours. And it is taking into consideration patients' convenience as well. Sometimes when patients are acutely unwell, they are with their relatives or they're looked after by somewhere else. So it's arranging that time within that period to assess those patients. When mental urgent care department patients are triaged as soon as they come in, like any other A&E. The 12-hour period is that we aim not to keep the patient in urgent care department for more than 12 hours.
Moving on to a slightly different topic, and it's about access to records. Amanda, could we put up paragraph 44 again, please, which is page 110 of the statement bundle? We're back here talking about the admission assessment at paragraph 44. And in the middle of the paragraph, you say the assessment includes a review of their records where possible, to gather information from any prior assessments and care plans and to identify any advanced choices. And I've already read out the rest of that. What records are reviewed? What are you referring to at pre-admission assessment?
It's a common clinical practice that before you see a patient, you try to gather as much information on the patient as possible, and this is the electronic records. If a patient is known to the services and has presented again, we would expect the clinicians to familiarize themselves with the previous clinical presentations so that they don't have to ask the same information again, and also gives them an indication of what the likely presentation is going to be.
What about if they're not known to the service, for example, or not have any significant prior history? What are the expectations on staff to gather and review information for these pre-admission assessments?
If it's a new patient, it's a, as I mentioned again, the first attempt would be to contact the patient and arrange for crisis teams to arrange. And if a patient is willing and happy for the clinician to contact the family to gather more information, there would be an expectation that they gather that relevant information from the family. Most of the times, patients are accompanied by family members, and the clinicians would talk to the families to obtain the objective information. In A&E, many a times, patients do come in urgent care department, do come with family members, are brought in by family members, and that forms a part of a routine, regular assessment.
You use the words where possible. When might it not be possible to review records or get prior information?
If there are no records, or if the patient does not have a family member, comes alone, we look after homeless patients as well. Many times they don't have anyone to look after them, so it's on whatever is available.
In paragraph 45, you refer to advanced statements. I'm not asking that to be put up, but you say some patients may have made an advanced statement while well, outlining how they wish to be treated in the event of a future episode of mental unwellness. We have, and you've produced, can we look at it very quickly, please, as your MK210. A leaflet, I think, dated 2022 about this. Yes. I won't ask for us to go through it, but identifying it there with that exhibit, how long, they say this is dated 2022, how long have EPUT had leaflets that they've provided to patients in order to encourage advanced statements?
I cannot say specifically about the advanced statements. The organization has had patient information leaflets for a long time. I remember in even South Essex Partnership Trust, when patients were admitted, they would have a patient information pack.
We'll come back to the information packs in a moment. What about these advanced statements? How long have patients been provided information about those?
I will have to get back to you on that.
And when in the process do the patients make those advanced statements? When are they invited to make those?
So when they're well, through their community mental health team, and when patients are admitted, when they recover, that information is there in the information pack, so they can make advanced statements with the subsequent treatment.
I'd like to move on to bed management, please. I'm dealing with topics, and in particular I'd like to ask you about single and mixed sex wards, which you deal with in your statement. Now, just by way of background, you may be aware the inquiry had a presentation last week which incorporated EPUT's response to a different Rule 9 request, I think which you reference in your statement, which asked for information about the mental health services it provided, the locations, and for some information about wards and the change in mixed sex and single wards. Can we have a look, please, at your table at paragraph 28 of your witness statement? We won't read it, but let's have a look at it. This is table 3. It starts and goes over the page. And what you've done in this table, and we can see, and I'll say it for the record or we won't go through it, is you've set out the speciality, the bed numbers, the number of wards, and whether they are mixed sex or single sex. So we see it starts there and then I think goes over the page. And then I think further down, I think we can see that most of the acute adult wards are single sex. Mental health assessment units are mixed, is that right?
That's correct.
Most of your older adult wards are mixed sex.
That's correct.
All but one of your secure wards are single sex.
That's correct.
All CAMS wards are mixed.
That's correct.
And I think, did you want to make a correction in relation to your paragraph 31? Could we expand paragraph 31, please, Amanda?
There is an error on the table as well.
Do you want to tell us where the error was on the table,
it
please,
says,
Dr. Corrali?
we have on page 10, second column, the 2 wards, mixed-sex adult wards. There's only 1 topaz ward.
Sorry, where is? Can you?
No, on page 10, on second line where it says 6.
In low secure?
No, that's a page before. Prior to that.
1106 you're referring to.
It starts with 36, sorry, that's the one where it says 2 wards, adult of working age, mixed sex wards.
So it's the top of 1105.
Adults of working age, mixed sex wards across Chelmsford and Colchester.
Okay, and with those 2 wards, and what should the correction be?
There's only one ward, which is a mixed sex ward.
Okay. And then going back to paragraph 31 of your statement then, please. Did you want to make a correction in 31?
Yes, as you stated, the old age wards are mixed sex wards.
Can I ask you about gender? At paragraph 31, you set out that gender can influence a bed placement for a patient. I'd like to understand what you meant when you referred to gender. You have mixed sex wards, we know, but I want to ask you about gender. Specifically, how does EPUT deal practically with patients who identify as a different gender to that they were assigned at birth?
There is a policy for treating such these patients. On a clinical or practical level, the staff would ask the person what the identified gender is. They would then, and what their preferred place of treatment would be. They would then undertake a risk assessment as to how safe it is to manage that person on that particular, their ward of choice. And it may mean that they might have to be on a 1-to-1 observation for a period of time based on the risk. So that's how practically the staff would manage.
Can I just
provide treatment.
Pause you? This is perhaps an example where you say they would. Are you aware of that happening in practice?
I've spoken to colleagues about it. I understand the trust policy is on the similar lines.
And that's a policy that you could provide to the inquiry?
Yes, we should be able to.
How does the trust accommodate gender non-binary patients? Is it the same?
The principles would be the same, patient choice, patient preference, and a risk assessment.
Can I ask you about sexual safety, which is at your paragraph 32? Can we look at paragraph 32, please? You say that a consultation took place with consultant psychiatrists to agree on responsibility for the patient wards, along with the multidisciplinary team. Some wards remained mixed sex where changes were not feasible due to the location and availability of showers and toilets. In such cases, the wards implemented guidance on maintaining dignity, respect and sexual safety, and you go on to deal with some of the measures that were implemented, which refers to sexual safety on mixed wards. It continues that they included the use of female-only lounges and swing rooms. And swing room is the term used to describe a hospital bed that can switch from a male to a female room to accommodate either sex for an admission on the ward during busy periods. So can you explain, please, for the inquiry, how are patients of different sex accommodated in mixed-sex wards? What are the arrangements? What happens with the bathrooms and the recreational rooms, so on?
So on a mixed-sex ward, there would be gender segregation. There were wings, and those there would be a female wing and a male wing. Males would not be allowed in the female wing. Their rooms, their toilets would be on that wing, and likewise there'd be a male wing for male patients. So that's the gender segregation, And
are the recreational rooms separate or are they shared?
Recreation rooms separate.
So how do the swing rooms work then in that context? Where are they?
So there'd be a door for the entrance of the female wing, and there'll be a male wing, a door, and there are certain rooms which are in between where the boundary of a female wing or a male wing can be changed depending upon the need of at the time.
And why do you say they make a ward safer?
The swing beds not necessarily make the ward safer.
Or the arrangements?
Because the males are not allowed to. It's not. I wouldn't use the word safe. It's safer compared to having mixed-sex wards. Single-sex wards. But the males are not allowed to enter the female corridor, and vice versa.
Do you agree that sexual safety can be an issue equally on a single-sex ward?
It can be, especially when many panic patients are disinhibited, and therefore level of observations for such patients are important.
In terms of staffing, is there an expectation that female-only wards will not be staffed by male ward staff?
I'm not aware of such expectation. It'd be difficult to. The recruitment is itself a challenge at present. So.
Moving a little bit to bed management then, please, and paragraph 33, please, Amanda, of the statement, which I think is 1107. Thank you very much. We see that decisions regarding the selection of bed type and ward for admission is dependent on a number of factors, including the age, the patient, severity of the presentation, and the application of the Mental Health Act. And you say this decision is made pre-admission by the referral sources and, depending on the service, agreed through the appropriate bed allocation system. So it's the referral sources, not the inpatient units themselves, that make the decision on bed type. Can you explain this, please?
So the crisis, I'll give you an example. A crisis team has gone in to assess a patient and decided the patient needs admission. If it's an informal admission, they would decide the patient goes to an assessment unit. If it's patient comes under after following an assessment, and the Mental Health Act would go straight away to a treatment. So that a distinction between where the patient goes. If a patient is quite very unwell, very aggressive, and needs more containment, the referrer would decide patient needs to go to a psychiatric intensive care unit rather than a general adult ward, and so forth. So there is some a decision made at the time of the assessment is the most suitable place. Obviously, they would try to treat the patient closest to their home, in an area which is familiar to the patient. But based on the type of the wards, mother and babies would go to a mother and baby unit, and so forth.
You make reference to the collaborative admission process. What's that?
So 2021, the specialist beds, certain areas, the forensic beds, child and adolescent mental health beds, mother and baby beds, they were they were initially managed by NHS England. They were then collaboratives. The providers were asked to set up collaboratives, and these collaboratives then manage the beds regionally. So, for example, EPUT is the lead for forensic beds. So, if a forensic patient requires a bed, there's a national process. They would make a request would be made to the collaborative. Collaborative would then send that referral to the local forensic services, who would then undertake a gatekeeping assessment. Likewise, for mother and baby unit, the decision. There are about 16 mother and baby units nationally. A patient can be placed anywhere based on the availability, but the initial intention would be to place the patient in your local mother and baby unit. So these are beds managed regionally or nationally rather than by a trust.
Can we go back to your statement, please, and paragraphs 36 and 37, which I hope will still be nearby, which is 1108, and just deal with this really briefly in light of a new document that's been provided. At paragraph 36, you indicate that EPUT currently operates a capacity, flow and escalation protocol, which is designed to support a consistent approach across adult services in EPUT. And it's right to say, and we see reference to it in the middle of that paragraph, that you initially provided the inquiry with an out-of-date copy of that protocol, that was MK29, and you provided the up-to-date version of that on Friday. Can you confirm that the new version, and just for the record, I think there is a gap even between the version at MK209 and the new version, I think it's 2019 to 2022, there's something in the middle there that we don't have. But in any event, the new version appears to have a number of documents embedded in it. Do you know what I mean by that? We can see where they are. Do you undertake to provide the inquiry with those embedded documents in due course so that the document can be understood fully?
The trust should be able to provide those.
The new protocol, it says within the document, was to reflect the new National Mental Health Operational Pressures Escalation Level Status. And you say it's the model the Trust is working towards. I picked that up from your paragraph 36. Is that, have I drawn the link correctly?
That's correct. And these are rapidly evolving processes, and things have, to some extent, change after that as well. As it stated, I've stated that there are 3 SITREP meetings. There are 7 SITREP meetings now in the organization, 3 in the morning in each locality, 3 in the afternoon in each localities, and 1 across the organization to manage the beds.
Can I say this? Can you also undertake to provide further evidence to the inquiry about that document once the inquiry is better placed to understand what EPUT is now doing?
I will.
Can I deal then now with bed management challenges, which you deal with in starting off in 37, where you have already explained that there is that adult and older people services are challenged at the present time with a significant demand for beds and a high number of patients placed outside of Essex, and with the independent sector both within and outside Essex. You also say Essex has also experienced a longer length of stay. What do you mean by that? What are you comparing Essex to when you say you've received a longer length of stay?
So the national targets set for length of stay for adult and old age wards. There's an expectation that average length of stay would be around 30 days. The length of the stay on the wards is much longer than the expected length of stay.
What is it what is the average in Essex? Do you know?
I'd be say it varies, but it'd be around 90, 100. Some of these long stay patients, the way it's calculated is also relevant. If a patient who's been staying for a long period gets discharged, that skews the length of stay, which is calculated at the point of discharge.
You've already made reference to the SIT-REP meetings. Can we look at paragraph, in fact, it's my fault it's not on the list, but could we look at paragraph 38, Amanda, which is just over the page, please? It says each person pending admission, as you've just discussed, is discussed on a twice daily SIPRET demand and capacity call. You've touched on it already. How long has that system been in place?
Before I say that, Chair, I'd just like to qualify the 90 days is a 10. It's not an exact figure. I'm just giving you an estimate. So, yeah. So the bed management, 2019. There's some reference. There was one administrator in the south and one administrator in the north, and it was very basic administrative function. It was in, I think, 2021 that the flow and capacity and such teams took precedence importance because of the bed pressures. The appointment of the clinical director and the strengthening of the flow and capacity teams is, I think, in the last couple of years. The 2021 onwards, I would say.
Okay. Paragraph 38 says decisions about priority admission are made by the clinical flow lead, the clinical director for flow, or the chair of the call. It says, I think, the clinical director for flow is a consultant psychiatrist. What is the professional background experience of the clinical flow lead?
She's a Band 8 nurse.
And what is the professional background and experience of the chair of the call?
The Band 8 chairs the meeting unless it's an OPL escalation where either a chief nurse or the medical director is expected to chair the escalation meeting. And
where are patients waiting? Sorry if that seems like an obvious question, whilst this admission is pending and this decision is being made.
So they use a tool called Smart Tool, which will identify how many patients are in the community waiting for bed, how many patients have had the mental health act assessments, either waiting in A&Es, either waiting in acute hospital beds. So they'll have that information of today in the morning, how many patients either in their homes, in the police, in A&Es, in police custody as well, who need admission, out of areas, Essex patients who are in London, and how many beds are available, and then they will. There'll be a clinical discussion around prioritization, which patient needs. The most important, which is bed urgently, and where is best place to admit that particular patient. So it's a clinical discussion that takes place in those situation report meetings.
And what are patients told about what's going on at that stage, if anything?
It's an assumption on my part that they would be saying that we are looking for a bed.
But that's, you say, a presumption on your part?
Yes, because the bed, if the clinician who's assessing has made a decision to admit the patient, they would then share that information that you need to be admitted. We are looking for a bed for you. Now that might take a while, and that decision is probably not made at the time by that clinician who's assessing. They will contact either the gatekeeping team or the bed management team, and that will be discussed at the SETRIP meetings.
Can you help us? What is the protocol for patients in crisis within the emergency departments where there is no specialist provision available locally or out of area? What happens to them?
So the emergency departments each hospital has a psychiatric liaison team, and the psychiatric liaison team will have nurses who would be prioritizing patients who attend the accident and emergency departments. So they are part of that psychiatric liaison team. They are also the gatekeepers, so they can make a decision. And if a patient requires bed, they will then contact the bed management team and say this patient requires bed.
Your paragraph 37, we don't need to look at it again. You've already touched on it, made reference to patients being placed outside of Essex.
Yes.
How do you, EPUT, manage and monitor the out-of-area placements?
So the care coordinator for the patient is expected to continue providing input to the ward where the patient is admitted. So we have contracted beds, so they are seen as in SX, which is seen as appropriate out-of-area beds, and ad hoc, which are seen as inappropriate, even though they are in SX. We have 2 Band 7 nurses who have specifically been appointed to oversee the patients who are placed out of the organization. They would liaise with the care coordinators, and every week they have a meeting. They use a dashboard which has a list of all the patients who are placed outside, when they were placed, what is their section. They also collect information on neurodiversity, so that is reviewed. And wherever possible, we'll try to repatriate those patients, but priority would be given to patients who are waiting in the community requiring bed. So there is an oversight on these patients who are placed outside.
We heard in our presentation last week, and I take it that covers beds in the independent sector as well.
That's
those
correct.
nurses are monitoring those. We heard in our presentation last week that in 2023 there were, I think, 35 NHS out-of-area placements and 799 independent sector placements. And those 2 band, if that's the kind of figures we're talking about, that's 2 Band 7 nurses overseeing all of that, is it?
So the 2 Band nurses, so most of predominantly are placed in Essex, in their private number of private providers, and would try to place patients in Essex. These 2 Band nurses will visit the Essex patients, but they'll also supervise, oversee the care coordinator. So even if a patient is placed elsewhere, the care coordinator is expected to reach into the wards, and these 2 Band nurses would get an update from the care coordinator. There are patients, there are services which we don't provide, and when our intensive care units are full, we do place patients out of Essex. We look for a bed, PQ bed wherever it's available, to manage that situation.
Can I just ask you, can I use mother and baby units as an example? Because I think you only have 5, now 6, I think,
6
beds in
yeah.
Essex, and you, as you say, there are a number of national units. So if somebody is placed, as this must often be the case, quite a long way away in a mother and baby unit, their care coordinator should be constantly overseeing, reviewing and feeding information back. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, plus for mother and baby units, there are perinatal services, so these patients would be open to perinatal teams.
Moving on to admission assessments, as in the initial assessment when a patient arrives on the unit. In your paragraph 27, please, Amanda, which is, I think, 1104, you say each admission into an EPUT unit should have a clearly defined purpose for assessment and or treatment that can only be delivered in acute inpatient care, and ensure that there is a therapeutic benefit to each admission. EPUT has developed a new therapeutic acute inpatient care operating model, which you reference, to assist in delivery of standards set by NHS England's guidance for acute inpatient mental health care for adults and older adults. By what method does EPUT ensure that there is therapeutic benefit to each admission? How do you ensure that and record it?
So this is, again, the same care CPA policy applies here. Every patient who's admitted to a ward will have a care plan identifying the care needs and the treatments, which would be psychological, pharmacological, and social aspects as well. So that care plan and the treatment plan would be the one that is reviewed in the clinical reviews, the ward reviews, your MDT meetings, and pre-discharge meetings.
How do you keep an eye on it? How do you monitor it?
Yes, the consultant has an overall responsibility of care and treatment on the ward. There are CPA care plan audits that are undertaken now. It's on a electronic system called Tendable. There are ward managers checklists, which are certain responsibilities which ward manager has, which are audited. The Tendable audit has an audit on care plan.
You touch on tendable audits in your statement, in fact, and it's something that we might come back to, as I say, at a later stage in the inquiry, given what I've already said about monitoring and evaluation. But you say that there are audits available
on
this
care
particular.
plans. Yes. Care plan it's not the only. It is one way of assessing, and as I said, it's the clinical oversight has to be with the clinical team to ensure that the patient they're caring receives the care the patient requires and deserves.
You say at your paragraph 27, if we could have that back up again. In fact, you may remember we just read it out, that each mission should have a clearly defined purpose for assessment. And at your paragraph 46, sorry, Amanda, it should be 46, please, which is 1110. When the assessing team concludes that an inpatient admission is required, the reasons are formalised in a purpose of admission statement. It reads, as that paragraph reads, as if the purpose of admission is decided by the team undertaking the pre-admission assessment. Is that right?
So this is something more recent. We heard from Dr. Davidson, it is in psychiatry. The decision was just admit the patient without any clear indication and purpose of why, and therefore it became quite difficult to provide a precise, identify the reason. So this is something that is, with the new operating model that's been introduced, so I wish to state that this is something that is more recent.
You talk about the new operating model, is there any guidance for those assessments teams then on how specific or broad the purpose of admission should be, how it should be recorded?
There are certain specific forms that need to be completed for the purpose of admission needs to be documented.
There are specific forms?
The purpose of admission should be documented. And it would take the policy states when you document the purpose of admission, you see whether it is the most appropriate, least restrictive, are the other alternatives like home treatment that have been considered. Is the admission likely to be beneficial or cause any harm to the patient? And for personality patients with certain conditions, there's specific other factors that are taken into consideration. So they have to demonstrate that they have considered all those factors.
And is there guidance on how to fill those, to complete that?
The SOP, there is a SOP for that particular purpose.
Is the purpose of admission something that's fixed at the time of arrival, or can it be reconsidered, reviewed, amended potentially once the patient gets onto the unit?
It should be reconsidered and reviewed at every clinical review.
At every clinical review?
The ward reviews and the multidisciplinary reviews.
We also see that as well as the admission purpose, which should be recorded in the referring gatekeeping assessment with a clinical record, there should also be an expected date of discharge. And we heard some evidence about this from Dr. Davidson in addition. Does this mean that the team deciding on the admission should also produce the expected date of discharge?
The expected date of discharge happens on the ward when the patient is admitted. There's no science behind it. It just focuses the mind of an inpatient treatment to keep the inpatient stay as less as required.
How often is it possible, or should I put it this way, how often is it not possible to provide an expected date of discharge? Or is one always, do they always come up with one?
As I said, it's an arbitrary, and it is how do you decide if a patient who's been admitted for treatment of electroconvulsive therapy or treatment-resistant schizophrenia, how long that patient is going to take? It's a tentative. It's easier for short admissions where you can, but what it means is that we're not leaving things, as Dr. Davidson mentioned, that once the treatment is over, then it decides where the patient gets placed. So, and that delays the length of stay. So the idea is to share with the patient that we're likely to require 5 or 6 weeks to get you discharged from the ward. That is reviewed regularly. It's not fixed. And most of the time it's an arbitrary.
does the discharge plan start at that time as well then?
The discharge plan should start. We have discharge coordinators, and their role is to see any obstacles to successful discharge.
We'll come to discharge coordinators in a minute, but the question is, does it start then as well?
It should start at the...
Right. We're now at a stage, I'm mindful of the time, but let's maybe do the next couple of topics. We're at a stage now where the patient arrives on the unit, and at paragraph 48, you say, and I think it'll come up, but I'll start reading it while it comes up. For individuals required as identifying informal admission, the pathway is for them to be admitted to the mental health assessment unit whenever possible. We'll come back to that. There are two in Essex, aren't there?
That's true.
A thorough assessment of the person's mental health presenting need is completed at the assessment unit, leading to the decision to either admit the patient to a treatment ward or discharge the patient from the assessment unit to the care of the appropriate community services. So the normal route, do we understand it for an inpatient, is through the mental health assessment unit?
For informal patients.
For informal patients, yes. We've heard about the urgent care department. You've already told us a little bit about this. What are the similarities, or do you go from urgent care to mental health assessment unit, or can you go from urgent care? How does this work in practice?
So the principle is similar to any acute hospital. Acute hospital is an A&E and also has a medical assessment unit where they keep admission patients for a short period. At the urgent care department, if the patient, we feel that the patient requires a brief stay for a couple of days to stabilize, for the crisis to be over, they'd be admitted to an assessment unit. But if there is the assessment leads to a conclusion that the patient is likely to require a longer period of stay, then they can admit patients to treatment ward directly.
So they don't need to go via the mental health assessment unit. Welcome packs and information leaflets then. You've already talked about the fact that you said that leaflets and welcome packs have been around for a while. We've just heard that the patients are admitted to the mental health assessment unit first. That's the normal route, although the urgent care department can send directly to the treatment ward. When do patients get their welcome packs? Do they get them, and their information leaflets, do they get them at the mental health assessment unit, or is it when they get to the final ward of stay? When are they given this information?
So the mental health assessment unit is a ward. It's a ward, so it is treated as a ward. So they would have their own welcome packs, but the patients receive welcome packs once they arrive on that particular unit. For that particular unit, the welcome packs for each unit.
So if you were on the mental health assessment unit and you only stayed there because it was a short stay, you wouldn't get any information?
On the treatment ward, because you're unlikely to go. You may not go on the treatment. Once you reach that particular ward, then you'd get information about that particular ward. If you get admitted to a mother and baby unit, they'd have their own information pack. CAMS units will have their own information pack, and so forth.
You have included a number of information packs within your exhibits. I'm not going to ask that we look at all of them, as that would take some time, but can I just ask that we look at MK214, which I think is at 859 internally, and 9105. This is a welcome pack. It's welcome pack version 6, and it appears to be, I'm just looking at the front cover, a generic, if you know what I mean by generic EPUT welcome pack, rather than a ward-specific one, because you've provided other wards and unit-specific ones. When would this one be provided? Not on the mental health assessment unit, as we understand it.
It's very difficult for me to say just on the front cover. There might be information inside about a specific unit, but if it's a generic then I'm not certain whether there is a generic for all the adult wards.
Can we have a look at paragraph 59 of your statement, which is at page 113. And we'll need to go over the page in a minute, but let's start at the bottom. Sorry, thank you. It says a holistic nursing assessment is undertaken within the first 24 hours of admission by a registered nurse, and the paperwork reviewed of any risk assessments or MHA paperwork for Mental Health Act paperwork for detentions that have already been assessed pre-admission. EPUT staff will undertake these assessments in line with trust guidance. This will include, and I'm not going to ask you about the other parts that we know about, but could we look at bullet point O, or little o, which is on the following page, please? It says, give the patient a welcome pack, including information about meal times, visiting times, contact details, my care, my recovery, those are plans, aren't they? The leaflet about home first leaflet, rights leaflet, sexual safety leaflet, why we hold you leaflet, Oxy Health fact sheet, etc. When would they all be together? When would the patients be given that welcome pack? Is that what you're talking about? All of those come together, do they?
That's my understanding. It's on admission. That's the checklist. Nurses have a checklist of once a patient's admitted, there are certain tasks they need to complete, and giving a welcome pack is a part of that checklist.
And you say that the holistic nursing assessment has to be undertaken within 24 hours. Does that mean a patient could be waiting 24 hours before they get information about meal times and when their family can come and visit and so on and so forth?
So it's 24 hours. It's done in stages. So not to overwhelm the patient as well. And once a patient enters the ward, it's about familiarizing the patient with the ward, showing their bedroom, asking the doctor to undertake an initial assessment, physical examination. So, and then maybe once the patient is settled down, the nurse may sit down to formulate a care plan. So it doesn't happen immediately. There are priorities, just getting those physical examinations and drug charts, medicines reconciliation, all those done on admission. So it's done in stages. The welcome pack would be offered to the patient once the patient are on the ward. It's about, and again, it will be catered to a patient as well. A patient is acutely distressed. You would focus on that particular aspect of care, settling the patient down.
And you say would, again, is that something that you know happens in practice or that should happen in practice?
That should happen.
And is this also the care plan process? Is that the care plan that's being produced as a result?
That's a checklist of all these things, and care plan is one of the items in that checklist. So check the CPA initial assessment and then start formulating a care plan, where the nurse would sit with the patient and look at what the individual aspects of treatment and care are, and that's reviewed in the ward rounds and the MDT reviews.
And for the record, thank you, Chair, can I clarify, that would include, and we don't need to look at them now, your exhibits MK2151, which is My Care, My Recovery Care Plan,
That's right, yeah.
and MK2152, My Care, My Safety Plan.
That's right.
Those are the documents that would be provided within 24 hours, and a nurse would sit down with the patient.
They would start
is that what
doing
you're
that.
saying?
Yeah. They may not be able to finish completing that within the time frame. But
You said it's been happening, or something along those lines, has been happening for a long time. Can you say how long it's been the practice to offer a welcome pack to patients arriving on the
Sorry,
ward?
say that again?
How long has it been the practice at EPUT to provide this kind of welcome pack?
When I can recall, and this is a recollection of working as a medical director for SEPT, that the some form of information was provided to patients even early on when I joined as a medical director.
So that's
in 2012. in
2012.
SEPT.
And you've already talked about a nurse sitting down in relation to the care plan. what other opportunities are given to patients who are arriving first time on a ward, for some of them potentially, to discuss all of this information that's been given? Are they left to look at it alone, or can they ask questions of people?
Certainly they'd be allowed to ask. They would be asked questions. It's done along with the patient.
I'm sure they're allowed to ask, but what are the opportunities for them to do it? Will somebody go and check they understand, or?
So that's the part of the developing a care plan where the nurse would, the doctor would, on admission, would undertake an history taking, will sit with the patient, do an examination, and the nurse would then explain what happens on the ward, take them through the process, show their room, and then sit down with the patient to take their own nursing history and do the nursing. So that's an interaction with the clinician and a patient.
And again, you're talking in terms of this is something that should happen.
That happens.
You say that happens.
A patient on admission would have a clerking by a junior doctor, by a trainee doctor. I would be surprised if a patient is not, unless the patient is too distressed and it's left for a while. Majority of cases, there might be exceptions.
Just to finish off this topic momentarily, at paragraph 47, we may not need to look at it again, you also make reference to information being provided to families and carers. You say that this information is shared with the person and, where appropriate, with their chosen carers and relevant partner services. Staff offer the patient an information booklet on the Mental Health Act at the appropriate time, and a carer's support information booklet to the carers to guide them while supporting the patient. That's in relation to the Mental Health Act. But there's also another leaflet, the MK212, which we'll come to a little later, which is the carers support information for carers. And you say that these patient information leaflets were updated in 2024 from the previous iterations. Again, when was the first iteration of the information for carers? How long has information leaflets been provided to carers?
I'll have to get back to you on that one.
And are families and carers given a copy of the same welcome pack as given to the patients?
I'm not certain on that either.
We'll come back to the carers leaflet when we talk about the involvement of families. Chair, we've been going, I think, for about an hour and 20 minutes. Would that be a convenient moment for a 10-minute break? Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Can I just ask a few more questions, please, about assessment on the mental health assessment unit prior to admission to what is deemed to be the appropriate unit? We will recall your paragraph 48. We could perhaps put it back up again, please, Amanda. That would be very helpful, which identifies the need for a thorough assessment for individuals identified as requiring informal admission. The pathway is for them to be admitted to the mental health assessment unit wherever possible, and then there is need. Then you go on to talk about a thorough assessment. You've also explained that that is the pathway for most, is to go via the mental health, for informal patients to go through the mental health assessment unit. In circumstances, however, where a patient has already been identified as requiring an informal admission, say from one of the gatekeeping teams, why is it necessary for them to be assessed again within the assessment unit?
Chair, before I answer this, can I quickly clarify a point on the earlier, in addition to on the family involvement, recognizing the importance of family involvement, and we know it hasn't been great. The Trust has recently appointed family support workers to liaise with the family rather than just relying on the leaflets and information. The reason for admitting these patients to an assessment unit, although it is called an assessment unit, we do provide treatment. And it is about, can these patients, with brief intervention, have their crisis managed rather than instead of going to a treatment ward. Sometimes patients have a brief crisis which settles down after a few days. Or if a patient has been recalled under CTO for a patient not taking treatment, we bring the patient to an assessment unit, get the patient started on treatment, and then patient is discharged. So the purpose is not only assessment, also brief treatment for brief periods.
Let me ask it another way. We've already heard about the urgent care department and how patients can go straight from the urgent care department to an inpatient ward, not going to the mental health assessment unit. And your statement says wherever possible. So other than the urgent care department, are there other circumstances where a patient could bypass the mental health assessment unit?
Mental health, you're talking about informal patients.
Yeah.
Elderly old age units would take patients directly without going through the assessment unit. Adults, if there isn't any bed on the assessment unit and a patient requires a bed, then the system is flexible. There are no rigid rules, and the bed management or the setup would make a decision to admit the patient directly to a treatment ward.
So
it's in general, the principle is that if a patient is an informal admission, let's route them through the assessment unit. It's not something which can't, it can be changed based on the clinical requirement needs.
Can we look at your paragraph 54, please? And I just want to clarify where you're talking about here. It says within the first 4 hours of admissions to the ward, as per the Royal College standards, the immediate care needs for the admitted patient is assessed by the ward resident doctor. And you go on to talk about the assessment being part of the clerking process. Is that 4 hours of admission to the mental health assessment unit or to another ward if they've bypassed the unit, or both?
If the patient goes through an assessment unit, the whole clerking assessment examination will take at the assessment unit. If the patient is then transferred from an assessment unit to a treatment unit, the treatment unit doctor would do maybe not a detailed clerking as the initial clerking because it's seen as a transfer, but they would do some form of clerking and examination of the patient.
So paragraph 54 applies to whatever ward the patient arrives on first.
That's right.
All right. You refer to the Royal College of Psychiatry standards, which date from 2019, and the first edition from 2015. What were the standards that were applied in the earlier part of the period we're concerned about, 2000 to 2015, as far as you're concerned?
On admission, the nurse in charge would ring the on-call doctor. After hours, the doctor would attend and do the clerking. During working hours, the doctor on the ward would do the clerking. So this has always been a standard practice.
Paragraph 56, I'm not going to go through them all. You set out the steps included in the medical assessment and clerking. And at paragraph 57, you say the designated consultant psychiatrist has medical responsibility for the patient during the admission. And at 58, you say the consultant psychiatrist has overall responsibility for treatment and diagnosis. So we take from that, do we, that it's the consultant who is the key decision maker at this time?
That's correct.
Paragraph 59, could we put that up, please, Amanda? 1113. It says the consultant I might be over, I think. Just over the page. We need to, yes, maybe we may need to go over, but we'll come to it in a moment. It says the consultant psychiatrist will see the patient formally within the first week as part of the MDT clinical review. Does this mean the patient may go a few days before seeing the consultant for the first time after admission?
Patients are definitely seen. So the practice varies. The minimum standard is that the patient should be seen first week, all of admission. All units, most of the units have a middle grade doctor or a specialty doctor. And if the consultant is not available, the specialty doctor would provide advice and support to the trainee doctor. The consultants work with the functional model. We have consultants working on the wards, and they are more or less on the ward most of the days. The consultant job plan is devised such that they have 1.5 days for other professional activities, 7.5 for direct clinical care, and there might be times when they're not seeing patients within the first 48 or 72 hours. Most of the patients would be seen within 72 hours of admission.
And sorry, I'm corrected, that would have been in paragraph 57. I think I said paragraph 59. I'm not going to take you through the rest of paragraphs 59 to 61, in which you set out the process and what should happen by the various points. But can I ask you this again? Is there a difference in the assessment process for somebody that was previously unknown, who's there for the first time, or, as opposed to somebody who had previously been known to services, or is it the standard?
The process will be the standard.
Just going back to the mental health assessment units, there's 2 in Essex, as you've identified.
That's correct.
Yeah. And they could be some distance away. Essex is a very big county from a person's home address. What is the benefit then of using an assessment unit in those circumstances? You've talked about it for people, the mental health assessment unit is you say there is a benefit if they could benefit from just a short period of stay. But putting those types of patients to one side for a moment, what is the benefit of using an assessment unit instead of admitting directly to a ward for others?
So when these assessment units were opened, there were two purposes. One is, as I stated, to undertake a comprehensive assessment rather than relying on a single assessment. But also at that time, once a patient was admitted to a treatment ward, there was a tendency for a patient to stay for a longer period. Things didn't move at pace. And the idea is if you admit a patient for 5 days on an assessment unit, you might be able to manage beds in a more effective way.
Is there a minimum period of time that an informal patient can stay on a mental health assessment unit?
The assessment units are they were opened with an intention of idea of not more than 5 days, but we have patients detained on the wards, and it's become how you best manage the situation if you require a bed. Patients get admitted to an assessment unit and then you realize they're not willing to take treatment, or they deteriorate, and then they'll end up being detained. And now ideally we don't want detained patients on the assessment unit, but for them to be for us to identify a treatment bed for them, but means that they land up staying on an assessment unit under section of the Mental Health Act.
I was going to come to a section under the Mental Health Act in a moment. It may be my misunderstanding. I thought it was informal patients that we were dealing with currently.
We do have, as I mentioned, that informal patients can be detained on the assessment unit and be on this assessment unit.
I understand. But just to pick up, if I understood, you're saying that the intention was that patients wouldn't stay more than 5 days.
That's correct.
There isn't a minimum period of time.
There isn't a minimum period of time. The idea is to undertake an assessment. If you can undertake an assessment within the first day and decide patient does not require to stay on the ward, or it's absolutely clear that the patient is quite unwell and needs treatment, you could move the patient to a treatment ward the same day.
Okay. Can I move then to Mental Health Act admissions? There is a distinction, you've made it clear in your evidence, it's in your paragraph 50 as well. Mental health admission is directly to a treatment ward, not via the assessment unit.
That's correct.
Why the difference?
To detain a patient against their wishes is an indicator of how unwell the patient is, and the patients are likely to stay for a longer period. It's different to someone having a brief crisis and requiring a brief support for a short period to keep them safe so that they can continue the treatment at home through the home treatment team. Detained patients usually tend to stay for a longer period.
We've already looked at your paragraph 47, so I'm not going to ask that we look at it again, but you'll recall it refers to the staff offering the patient an information booklet on the Mental Health Act at the appropriate time. When is the appropriate time for staff to offer a patient who is subject to a formal admission, in the circumstances that you've just described, potentially, an information booklet on the Mental Health Act?
When the patient is settled, patient might be too distressed, quite unwell, quite paranoid, and may not be in a mental state to receive the information, and there is no point providing that information when he's too disturbed or unwell. And as the patient improves, that would be, in my opinion, the best time to provide that information to the patient.
Can I just ask you about some challenges relating to admission? Paragraphs 44 to 89 are where you've set out in your statement what should happen, which is arguably to reflect, what would be good practice. But just in terms of challenges, we've looked at 59 to 61, albeit the latter part briefly, and reference to holistic nursing assessment. They must take some time to complete.
They do take some time.
How long?
It's done over a period of time, so the care plan, the different aspects to it, and so physical examination, say, would take 10-15 minutes, so the blood investigations, taking history would take 1 hour for a trainee doctor. The nurse probably taking her own assessment would spend an hour or so at the beginning, and then there are other assessments, VT, venous thromboembolism assessments, your if on old age wards, falls assessments. So these would be done over a period of days.
And can I assume from what you've said and what you've described with different personnel involved that there are challenges, for example, if you've got staffing issues?
Staffing is.
There are challenges with that holistic
yes,
assessment if there are staffing issues.
Yes.
Any other challenges?
I think staffing would be the main. Yes, even if the ward is quite unsettled and disturbed, the admitted patient should receive the initial assessment, the care plan. So that would, I presume, and the clinical presentation could be another challenge. So the patient is ready well enough some patients refuse physical examinations, blood investigations, and you have to wait till they are amenable or agreeable to those assessments.
Can I just ask, I appreciate that we're putting this as a more complicated topic for further investigation, but is there monitoring of compliance with this holistic assessment requiring, is it?
The care plans are monitored. The physical examination and the clerking is taken. I think there's a discharge summary which covers all those aspects of initial assessment, initial presentation, that's shared with the GP and the clinical team. So discharge summary would include all those aspects of initial history, the stay on the ward, the treatments that are offered, along with the treatment plan.
Is there monitoring of the timing, whether they're seen in 4 hours by the doctor and 24 hours by the nurse?
I'm not certain about the monitoring of the timings.
Is there monitoring about the information being provided?
Information.
Well, There's information, the welcome packs, information about advocacy, that kind of thing.
So there are ward managers' responsibilities, and there are audits. I'm not entirely clear what a ward manager audit, which areas they cover, but they do cover areas like evidence that families have been involved, or patient-led goals have been included. So there are various ward-level audits that are undertaken.
Are there monitoring of safeguarding issues raised?
Safeguarding team would do their own. There would be safeguarding audits in the organisation.
You've just said that the care plans were monitored.
Are monitored.
Are monitored, sorry. Who has responsibility for the care plans?
The care plan should be audited by the ward manager. Ward manager would have the overall responsibility of ensuring care plans are done.
Can I move on? We'll come back to care planning in a moment, but can I come back to consideration of other personal characteristics and comorbidities at admission? Just dealing firstly with physical health considerations and how you deal with those. You provided the inquiry with MK228, which is a policy dated 2023, although it looks like it was first published in June 2022. Could we just have a look at that, please, Amanda? I think it's at 9514 it starts, and it's at 1268 internally. These clinical guidelines represent a decision by the Trust, I think, to move to the use of the National Early Warning Scoring System 2, NEWS 2.
Yes.
And if we look at paragraph 2.1, which is on page 9518 or 1272 internally, it explains what that is, which is that the Royal College of Physicians originally developed NEWS to standardise the assessment of acute illness severity across the NHS, and that it's used a surveillance system for all inpatients, tracking their clinical physical condition, and that NEWS 2 is the latest version of the National Early Warning Scores, first updated in 2012 and updated in December 2017, which advocates a system to standardise the assessment and respond to acute illness. And then it goes on to set out what NEWS 2 is intended to, is used to improve, which the assessments it's intended to improve. So NEWS 2 is used to monitor, and if we look at, I think, 5.5, which is, so I think we need to go to 1275. Do we see at 5.1 that NEWS 2 must be used for all inpatients or when a decision has been made to admit, and that at 5.5 it sets out the physiological observations that are required. And I think if we look at page 9525, apologies, I haven't got the but it may be that you can help us with this, and we don't need to look at it, that the minimum rate is, I think, every 12 hours. Does that sound right?
Sorry, say that again. 12.
Sorry, it's my fault. Let's look at table 2. That is the clinical response. That is the timings for which monitoring should be carried out.
It's no. So. MEWS is a nursing assessment of a rapid deterioration of a patient. This is in addition to the physical examination and monitoring undertaken by the junior doctors and the consultants of chronic medical conditions and other medical conditions. This is specifically focusing on rapid deterioration, monitoring the pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and other vital parameters. What it means is that if the MEWS score is 0, that means there are no concerns, and you just monitor an hour. As the concerns increase, as the score increases, there are, then you need, how quickly should you raise the matter with the ward doctor or the senior member?
You've referred to Muse, which I think is the system. This is News too. But to clarify, News 2, according to this document, it is applied as appropriate.
All patients on the wards will have News.
Within mental health units. Yeah. Can I ask you about neurodiversity considerations, please? We looked at this in part yesterday in relation to pre-admission assessments. Can we look again, please? Sorry. No, in fact, for a moment, it doesn't matter. Let's just go back to paragraph 44, which we've already looked at, where we know that the inpatient admissions into EPUT includes a review of their records where possible to gather information from any prior assessments and care plans and to identify advanced choices. And some sort of assessment. Also, there's reference to information from prior assessments and care plans. What provisions are there in relation on admission assessments for neurodivergence to determine whether a patient is fit for a specific area?
So the clerking, the initial assessment where a doctor should identify there are the patients have autistic traits or have autism. In addition, consultant input and wards have ward psychologists who are trained at identifying, and they would help the inpatient team to make reasonable adjustments and develop a care plan. What is required for a patient who's present who has neurodiversity?
Can I just ask if we can jump ahead to your paragraph 90, please, which is on 1123. Which says on admission, initial assessments from the medical and nursing team will review any information supplied during the pre-admission stage of diverse patient needs and adjustments for language, cultural considerations or specific conditions like neurodiversity and physical cognitive disabilities, and seek solutions and inclusion in the development of the care plan. How are those pre-existing conditions, including autism or the effect it may have, included in the patient's diagnosis and care plan?
So if the patient already has a diagnosis of autism, then there would be a CTR review, community treatment review, which would decide what's the treatment plan for the patient. What's the best option for the patient, so that patient comes with some information through the CTR. Patients have My Passport, My Health Passport, that would have some information about a patient. But it will be the team would rely on consultant, the ward psychologist, to help them devise a care plan more appropriate to the needs of the person with neurodiversity.
So you agree that some specialist input should be sought wherever possible?
Yes, we have appointed a consultant psychiatrist for ASD. Her role is not to take, she doesn't have a caseload. Her role is purely supportive and advisory. This is in the more recently.
How long has that been in place?
Year and a half or 2 years at the most.
And before that?
And there's an option of second opinions. They could contact consultants asking for our head of autism services. She makes herself available if the team requires some additional support advice on treating such patients with autism.
If we look at your paragraph 96, please, which is at 1124. It suggests that in the absence of a diagnosis, staff supporting patients who report experiencing difficulties consistent with neurodiversity can still consider making reasonable adjustments. Do you accept that they should consider making? They should rather than can. And I know we touched on this yesterday, but what specific reasonable adjustments do you say should be considered or made for a patient with a neurodevelopmental condition or difficulties consistent with such a condition?
So it's more about providing clear, concise information about the ward routines, ward structures, mindful of the communication patterns, give information and the flexibility in terms of their requirements. The environment, providing calming environment. So, as I mentioned, some wards have sensory rooms, sensory areas, providing some aids like headphones if they want to dampen the noise on the ward. So that would form part of their care plans.
You've made reference to the health passport, My Health Passport. Is there any monitoring, do you know, to evaluate how reliably staff explore whether a patient has one or whether they look at one?
My understanding is patients who have health passport are quite good at, sharing their. I'm not certain whether that's monitored on the wards.
You say that's your understanding. Is that your experience as well?
I haven't worked with patients with learning disabilities.
Where's your understanding from?
It comes from people who have autism are quite structured, concrete. So it's structured. And I qualify my statement. That's an assumption on my part.
It's an assumption.
Yeah.
You told us a little bit yesterday, and I said we'd come back to it today, about training that's given in relation to neurodiversity. Can we look at your paragraph 91, please, which is on 1123, in which you say staff across the Trust receives role-specific, competency-based mandatory training on neurodiversity, and the Trust has commissioned the Oliver McGowan Learning Disability and Autism Training in 2023, developed for this purpose, which is the NHS England's preferred and recommended training for health and social care staff. Compliance is monitored and reported across the Trust community and mental health services. And as I say, you referenced this repeatedly yesterday when I was asking how EPUT were helping and supporting staff identify and take into account neurodevelopmental conditions at pre-admission assessment. So we see that it was commissioned, I think it was 2023. Since when has it been delivered? How long has the Trust been delivering that training?
I'll have to get back to you on that one.
You've referred to compliance, and you provided to the inquiry a training compliance record. Can I just ask you about that? It's your MK2238, and it's in the 6A bundle, Amanda, which it's at 15912 for anyone following the main numbering or internal page number 11. I just wonder if you could help us a little with this. Do you see it? You recognise? No, it's not quite there yet, I don't think. Are we able to go in a little bit closer? Thank you. On 15912. It's the table. We see there are two parts to the training. Can you see it now?
Okay.
Yes, there are two parts to the training. Part one, and you set out overall competence, and then you set out the component parts. Part one, is that online?
It is online training.
And would that explain why there is a reasonable compliance rate? Part two, poor compliance. I think you would probably agree. what's happening there? Is that in an in-person training?
It's a day's face-to-face training, and I think it was due to the limitation of the slots, which I understand have been increased recently.
Who delivers it?
It's the training department oversees the delivery, but I'm not sure.
Right.
The training department would oversee the delivery of the core and mandate trainings, essential training.
You have explained that it is a statutory requirement. Yes? Does this compliance record mean that the Trust isn't meeting its statutory obligations?
It's the part one is for everyone, and it provides a basic understanding of what the presentation, what the needs are, what reasonable adjustments need to be made. I think part two is more specific and detailed training.
Do you know what part two involves?
As I said, it's a face-to-face, a full-day training.
And what does it cover?
It covers more detailed specifics around communication patterns and other aspects of care and treatment.
Would you agree with the suggestion that that level of compliance might indicate that staff are not well informed or prepared for issues that might arise?
So I'm aware that psychology department has provided training to ward staff, and they have several other programs. The ward psychologist, each ward has a psychologist, and the psychologist would, if a patient is admitted with who has neurodiversity, would provide that guidance, support to the staff.
You mentioned that, in fact, I think, and I won't go to it as such, at paragraph 119D. But is that the way EPUT is addressing the problem of this, accessing this mandatory training?
We would want to increase the number of slots and availability for the training. I understand having face-to-face makes it somewhat challenging.
Are EPUT staff specifically trained, perhaps in your, I'm going to call it in-house, with your psychology teams, to seek expert input on neurodiversity?
The expert advice and support is available to the staff through the autism consultant, through the autism team, and through the psychologists on the ward.
Does that training given by the psychology team, how does that fit in with the statutory requirements, with your duty to provide the training?
I'm probably not the best person to answer that.
Can I turn to the question of diagnoses more generally? At your paragraph 101, I'm just going to summarise, you state the admitting doctor usually will consider various differential diagnoses, and at 104 you suggest that the patient will have a provisional diagnosis during the first 24 hours. Is that realistic?
That's a standard practice. Every doctor would give a provisional diagnosis on which the initial treatments started.
And do you agree that it's, or what is your view, I should perhaps ask, what is EPUT's view on, we've heard evidence from Dr. Davidson about it last week, about whether it's a patient should be discharged with a diagnosis, the importance of a diagnosis on discharge?
We do provide a diagnosis on discharge, and that's a requirement. I understand naturally to provide a diagnosis on discharge.
You gave evidence yesterday about, and I won't go back to it, but you'll recall about challenges when a patient is under the influence of alcohol or drugs or experiencing withdrawal symptoms. What are the diagnostic challenges involved in distinguishing between drug-induced behaviours and conditions and those which are unconnected but are complicated by the presentation?
So if a patient presents with psychosis as a result of drugs, the drug-induced psychosis, the treatment would predominantly be the same. Would still treat the psychosis element of it. If a patient has, say, alcohol and is withdrawing, the wards would provide a detoxification. So the treatment would be based on the condition, the diagnosis, and the clinical presentation. A drug-induced psychosis is a standard treatment process. Likewise, if someone's withdrawing, there'll be a standard treatment process.
Were there any specific standards or best practice guidelines that EPUT were following in respect of approach to formulating a diagnosis in those circumstances where a patient has comorbid alcohol or substance misuse?
We follow the International Classification of Diseases 10, ICD-10 diagnostic criteria.
Can I move to an overview of the inpatient experience and particularly interaction with staff? The interaction of staff, would you agree, is a central part of the inpatient experience?
That's correct.
You give a lot of evidence, and I'll try and deal with it quickly, about the MTT and the multidisciplinary team overview. Can we begin, please, by looking at your paragraph 114, which is on page 1128. You indicate that the staff that interact with patients include members of the MDT, which has a core membership, and you list them there: the consultant psychiatrists and other medical staff, nursing staff and mental health support workers, including the patient's key worker, psychotherapists, clinical psychologists and psychology team, occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, activity coordinators, social workers, and approved mental health professionals. Are those persons present or available on every ward?
AMS don't work on the ward, so the last statement, last point is not correct.
Yes, well, that was going to be my next question.
And,
what is AMP
social
involvement
workers
in,
as well.
what is AMP involvement in inpatient care?
I presume they're probably involved is when a patient is detained on a ward, is the responsibility of the approved mental health professional to in-reach and share the details of the assessment. So, but other than that, that AMP do not form they are not the co-member of the team. That's an error.
At paragraphs 116 and 117, I'm going to summarise. You describe the role of the psychological services team, and at paragraph 119, you state that there are multiple types of psychological treatments offered to patients, including one-to-one, groups, variation on group contact, indirect work. And you also make reference to an exhibit, can I ask you about, please, which is your MK256, which is at page 10,009 of the Exhibit 6 bundle, which is an internal number of 1763. It's a document from, it hasn't arrived yet. Sorry, Amanda, I realised we were going between bundles. Inpatients, this is from February 2025. Can you help us? What is this document, please? How did it come about?
I think it's a document prepared by the psychology department. I see it as to give an understanding of what the number of different types of types and numbers of psychologists are there on the inpatient units.
And to be clear, this relates to this year, early this year, February 2025. It says at the top.
That's right. Okay. It looks like an update on the current positions of psychologists on the inpatient unit.
Just dealing with some other aspects of psychological treatment. At your paragraph 123, I think that can come down, thank you, Amanda. 123, you say in older adult services, this is at your statement, defined as age 70 and over, you say that, and for patients with a frailty score of 5 and above, the Mid-Essex Psychology Services team have implemented a pyramid of care to organise psychological input for an individual on the ward. And you explain the difference, I think, between psychological input in your statement to adults and older adults. Can I just clarify something? At paragraph 127, and sorry, just to confirm, if one reads through your statement 124, 125, 126, they're all paragraphs referring to older adults.
That's correct.
And that's what I want you to clarify. In 127, 128 and 129, you deal with that in Med-Essex prior to 2011 there was no funded dedicated psychology provision to inpatient services. I'll come back to it in a minute. In 128 in West Essex, there was no ward-based psychological therapist staffing provision prior to 2018. And in South Essex, psychology provision was in a similar position with no dedicated funding resource pre-2018. Can you clarify, is that still all referring to older adults?
That's my understanding.
Well, it's your statement.
It is referring to.
And so prior to that time, was there no funding?
There was an input from psychologists where most of the psychological activities were provided by the nurses and occupational therapists trained in providing psychological interventions with an oversight from a psychologist. But the wards did not have individual psychologists.
So it was done by other healthcare professionals with oversight. I'm not going to ask you about all of them, but you've listed other members, as we've seen, of the MDT, and you deal with them in your statement in sections. Can I just ask, what is the role of the case coordinator, the care coordinator? Is that the person as part of the CPA?
Community care coordinator, that's correct. The understanding is if a patient is admitted on the ward, means that the presentation is complex and warrants and needs a care coordinator to coordinate the care post-discharge.
You refer to a key worker in your paragraph 114B and key worker interactions in 165. What is the key worker? What
Key
is the role
worker
of
is
the key
the
worker?
worker on the ward, the name nurse. The terminology is different, but the role is pretty much the same. The care coordinator is someone from the community team who is reaching into the ward, following the patient from the community into the ward after his patient's discharge. Key worker or the named nurse is the one who's on the ward.
Well, I was going to ask you about the named nurse or the allocated nurse. What's their role?
So they have an overall responsibility of ensuring that the aspects of care for that particular patient on that ward are completed, are taken care of under the supervision of the nurse in charge. So every patient has, so there for some continuity of care so that it is not a piecemeal care. There's one nurse who has been identified as the key nurse for that patient who would follow the patient throughout the journey on an inpatient ward.
Ward round and other meetings, again, hopefully I can deal with this quickly, and I'll make reference to your statement but won't necessarily ask that it be put up. You've given various meetings and types of meetings. In paragraph 57, you refer to the MDT clinical review. In paragraph 163, you refer to ward rounds, which range from weekly to fortnightly, depending on the individual unit's frequency. At paragraph 165, you refer to a minimum of weekly formal reviews through ward rounds, care rounds, MDT meetings, and key worker interactions. In paragraph 168, you say ward rounds take place weekly or fortnightly, depending on the units. And we've, at paragraph 408, which is much later on, and we've heard some evidence about it from our experts, there's reference to huddles and to team meetings. Can you help us, please? How do all these meetings relate to each other?
So there's every day there's a morning nursing handover morning and evening. So that's about looking at what care has been provided and what care needs to be provided on that day. The MDT meeting is where the team professionals will meet and look at the progress, what the needs are, share their information. Psychologist has undertaken assessment.
And how often is that?
That's weekly, and a clinical review, a ward round. And there's an impression that a ward round, everyone's present, but they could be just the ward, the consultant, the ward, the minimum, the consultant, the representation from nurses, the trainee doctor, and family members, and the patient. So that ward round will involve the presence of a patient and the family member.
And the MDT meeting?
MDT is about reviewing the progress and what needs to be done. That will be shared with the patient in the ward round.
And what the ward round, I think you've said, is can range from weekly to fortnightly. So there is an MDT meeting and a ward round every week? That's
correct. When you say ward round, it's not like morning 9 to 5. The ward round could be spread out throughout the week depending upon the consultant, because some consultants may see patients throughout the week, 2 slots, say in the morning. Some consultants might want to do it on 2 days or 3 days, so it varies, but every patient should have a review by a consultant once a week.
And what's a care round?
Care round?
Something reference to a ward round, care rounds.
Probably is the ward round.
Key worker interactions?
Key worker interactions are one-to-one time spent with the key worker.
In paragraph 169, sorry, there's one I should have asked you about. Which other meetings, I shouldn't ask you about huddles, would the families and carers be present or invited to?
The families are invited to the ward rounds, and if the family wants to meet with the consultant, the ward clerk or the medical secretary should arrange for a time with the family. So there's no hard and fix, because these are ward consultants. They should have time throughout the week to meet the families at the family's convenience.
Huddles? And yes, thank you. And huddles, I mentioned them but didn't go back to them.
So the huddle is where anyone on the ward can ask for a huddle if there is an incident or there is a need for a matter to be discussed, and it is also about staff providing emotional support to each other. Suppose a patient has been there's been an incident, and the incident's been dealt with. It's about checking how staff are all right, what's the situation, what's the ward temperature, right? So these are at least one huddle a day to look at the ward temperature, how the staff are coping and managing, and any incidents.
We also heard, I think, that matters might be discussed, such as what did we achieve yesterday, what do we need to achieve today? Would that be discussed in a huddle?
No, that's a red to green meeting. That's in another meeting soon after the handover, where they would quickly go through each patient to see whether the tasks that were allocated yesterday were completed. That means green. If not, then it's red. And if there are 3 or 4 red days, then the matter needs to be escalated, seeing that nothing seems to be happening by keeping the patient on the ward, and it's just an escalation process.
At paragraph 169, you say some units, patients require more frequent interaction. What units, which type of units?
Every unit, as the patient's admitted, they are quite unwell and they would have more interactions. The doctors would see them more frequently, and as they get better. I would say PQ probably is an example where patients acutely distressed and disturbed and would have greater input and interaction.
How often during their stay or time on a ward should a patient have first of all, in the assessment unit, should patients have direct contact with a consultant?
On an assessment unit, patients, there are ward rounds every day on an assessment. So 2 doctors see patients every day.
And once transferred to the treatment ward?
Then the consultant should see at least, as a minimum, once a week. But that could vary. The consultant could see the patient every day, depending on the clinical presentation. It need not be, a ward round for patients. Consultant don't need to wait for a ward round to see a patient.
Do I assume from previous answer given that the level of contact may well vary between those on a ward voluntarily and those detained under the Mental Health Act?
Not necessarily.
You refer in paragraph 242, and deal with it, I hope, briefly, to the use of seclusion and long-term segregation. That increases the need for contact, doesn't it? How often should a patient in seclusion have direct contact with a consultant?
So no informal patients secluded. There's a code of practice, so the patients are detained, and there are strict guidelines for code of practice in terms of what needs to happen. Patients on constant observation. They have 2 hourly nursing checks, 4 hourly medical checks. There's an MDT first.
The question was about the consultant contact.
Consultant has to see within first 12 hours. A consultant has to see. So there is a MDT review that needs to take place. That specific time specified in the code of practice.
And in long-term segregation?
Long-term segregation is there are times specified in long-term segregation. Long-term segregation is slightly different in the sense that it is patients treated in a segregated area. It is slightly different to secluding in a room.
So how often should they have contact with a consultant? I'll have to get back to you on that one. Paragraph 165, you say that patients can request additional meetings with any member of the multidisciplinary team. How are patients told about that? Are they told they can ask for a meeting at any time?
So on the ward, there would be a display of the nurses that are present and the nurses identified for that particular patient. So then patients would approach staff on the ward asking for more time or one-to-ones.
We've touched on this, or what the impact of staffing issues can be in relation to the holistic assessment. In your experience, have staff vacancies affected the inpatient pathway? You have referred to difficulty with pharmacists, which we'll come on to, and some difficulties with psychological services. Have there been other staffing issues over the relevant period?
Yes, in past there have been issues around, and this safer staffing concept came from, and that was rather minimum staff required to manage a ward safely. Trust has recently increased the number of minimum staff qualified from 2 to 3. But there have been pressures on inpatient wards, which is monitored by CQC as well.
Can I jump, please, to psychological treatment? At paragraph 117, you say all patients, and we've looked at this, have access to inpatient psychological ward-based groups. And on paragraph 173, you list treatments that are available. You also refer to visible and available time. What's that, please?
That's a concept the psychology department has introduced, where it is more about patient being able to approach the psychologist, and the psychologist being visible on the ward and available on the ward.
So does that literally mean a psychologist present?
Yes, it's about visibility of a staff.
I mean actually present, being on the ward?
Being on the ward. Yeah.
And how's that changed as a concept over the relevant period? Is that something that's quite new?
It's something new.
How new?
I would say fairly recent. We can get back to you on when it was introduced and started.
And what benefit does it have for patients on wards? This more visible and available time.
Being that there's a psychologist and psychological interventions can be provided, and patients can access that support and intervention.
And is it? I was about to say, what is the availability of visible and available time? But at the moment in EPUT, how is that working out in practice?
It's an initiative by the psychology department. It's a fairly recent initiative. I'm probably not well versed with all the aspects of that initiative. We can get the head of psychology to provide more information on that intervention.
the treatments you list, certainly at paragraph 172, include psychological and social interventions. And can I just ask this question? If a patient suffers from comorbid alcohol dependency or substance misuse issues, would it be expected that they receive specific psychological and social interventions as part of their inpatient care plan?
Not necessarily.
Why not?
The treatment of alcohol withdrawal and alcohol, long-term in terms of their motivation, these are services provided by specialist drug and alcohol services, where patients' motivation is important. Patients usually don't, especially on adult wards, don't stay for a longer period, and we do not have in reach of drug and alcohol services on our wards. At one stage, drug and alcohol services were provided by specialist mental health services. Most of the drug and alcohol services are now provided by third sector providers.
Just returning to neurodiversity again, during the course of the inpatient stay, can I just ask very quickly that paragraph 94 be put back up again? It's at page 1124. You refer to the good practice document, MK2-240, on full assessments of potential neurodiversity, indicates it's a specialist and complex assessment, and you list the different healthcare professionals that should be involved. Can I ask about the reality of that with a patient who has developmental conditions or is presenting as consistent with that possibly? How often would a full assessment with all those people take place?
It's unlikely to take place.
I mean, I was going to say, what are the barriers, but why is that unlikely? You seem very clear on that.
One is the resource. As from yesterday's statement, full assessment of autism can take place 4 or 5 hours. It's a very cursory small team, which autism assessment service, and the care can be provided on a needs basis rather than a diagnosis. It's the question is how important is diagnosis of an autism to provide appropriate, reasonable adjustments in care and treatment for someone with autism.
And who provides it on the needs basis that you've just described?
It's the ward team and the ward psychologist.
The ward psychologist. Medication for a moment, please. At paragraph 106, you need to go to it now, but you may want to refer to it. You refer to patient information, including information from medicines. You say about medicines from GPs. Historically, EPUT and predecessor organisations had no easy access to any of the GP information. Over the last 5 to 6 years, this has improved with the availability of shared care portal and other medicine reconciliation practices, which came into effect in later years. And it's right, I think, a medication reconciliation is comparing a patient's medication orders to all of the medications that the patient's been taking. It's matching them up to avoid errors. What processes has the Trust used, or does the Trust use, to ensure accuracy of medicines reconciliation?
So the junior doctor at the time of writing a drug chart would do a medicines reconciliation, see with what medications the patient comes in, and what is written on the records. He or she, if unsure, may not write all the medications and write the necessary medications. The pharmacy department, the pharmacist in reaching into the ward would then do a thorough medicines reconciliation.
I'll come back to the pharmacy department in a moment, but do you think there's excessive reliance on patients to tell the team about their medications?
So depends what time the patient's been admitted as well. If a patient's admitted in the middle of the night, either the information is with the patient or the medication the patients bring. Sometimes patients come up with their community prescription chart, and some information will be on the clinical records. Some information can be collected from the family as to what medication the patient's taking or is given. During working hours, there's an option for the trainee doctor to contact the GP surgery and get that information if he or she is unsure.
And what happens if the patient isn't able to help? Because sometimes patients don't necessarily know all of the medication that they are taking, and records are difficult to get hold of. What happens then?
Psychiatric medications, they would write, if a patient is presenting with a psychotic illness, they would start the patient on some antipsychotic medication to manage the acute condition. But the next day, a thorough reconciliation, medicines reconciliation can take place. So the doctor may just write the medicines essential for that till that information can be collected.
Paragraphs 208 to 210.
And most of the psychiatric medications for depression, they don't act straight away anyway. Antidepressants takes 2 weeks to act. So.
You deal with medication and reviews and discussion with the patients at your paragraphs 208 to 210, and you deal with reporting side effects and so on. What are the key areas? Where are the key problem areas where incidents may arise in relation to medicines and medication?
Compliance is an issue. Can be certain medications cannot be started in the community and require an inpatient, and beds are not always available. These are planned admissions. The monitoring of certain medications, lithium or clozapine, needs to be done carefully. There are certain guidelines now on medications like sodium valproate, where patients need to be women of working age and men shouldn't be on sodium valproate. So there's a monitoring for specific medications. On the ward, I would say main issue would be on ensuring patients the medicines reconciliation has been done and the compliance. Patients may refuse to take medication.
You've already touched on pharmacists and their role in reconciliation, and your statement makes clear that they play an important role in the safe and effective delivery of pharmacological treatments. Can I just ask some very brief questions, mindful of the time? You deal at your paragraphs 181 to 83 with the fact that there were significant vacancies in pharmacy staff. It was in the corporate risk register, certainly at one point, and that shortages were a national issue. You say at 183 that recruitment appears to have improved over the last 6 months, and I think that your vacancy rates are listed at 9.9% in December. You also state at 207 that in 2 years post-COVID, pharmacist vacancies rose dramatically, and it's only in 2024 to 25 that input towards has started to return to pre-merger levels, that being That's 2017. Correct. Can we understand the impact of all this, please? What is the practical effect of the shortage of pharmacists on patient treatment and care? Can I ask you about three? Firstly, is it problematic in terms of contribution to the care plan for medication?
Not from the care plan.
No. What about from advice? Is it problematic because people can't get advice on the right medications?
That's true.
Does it lead to practical problems with dispensing, getting hold of the medication?
So can I just correct this first point when you're talking about the medication drug charts? The pharmacist would reach on the wards and check the drug charts. So that's an additional layer of safety for prescribing. So that is an important role which pharmacists play.
So if we're short of pharmacists, that's a problem as well. So checking the drug charts, lack of advice, problems with dispensing, potentially.
Dispensing, but to the best of my understanding from the head of pharmacy, that was never compromised. So they, because of the shortages, they prioritized and focused on ensuring that the dispensing takes place.
But does the reality from what you've told us mean that if there is a significant lack of pharmacists, there's a pharmacist crisis, as was indicated, there is the potential for direct impact to patients by virtue of either not having the optimal medication or the right medication, or...
So the medication was provided at the time, so dispensing wasn't affected. It was the activities like research was stopped, the advice that was affected, and the pharmacist visiting the wards and checking the drug charts was affected.
I'm going to deal with just one or two questions about restrictive practices. We have already, that's just dealing with observation levels. We've already looked at paragraph, I think, 56H, which was the medical assessment and clerking. And as part of that, you will agree, H, just to remind those who saw it before, it was to agree initial engagement and observation plan with the patient. And at paragraph 62, you say the nursing assessment will include agreeing the therapeutic engagement and support observation level in line with trust policy. And at paragraph 2021, you say risk of harm will determine the type and frequency of observations that staff will undertake. And at the end of that paragraph, you refer to MK 229, which is a document entitled Therapeutic Engagement and Supportive Observation Policy in Patients. Could we just put MK 29 up, please, which is page 9542 or internal 1295. This is a current document again. Can we just look at various... Sorry, let me just get mine up. Can we go to page 1? I think you may already there. 1, 2. Yes, sorry, you're already there. Thank you. So looking at 4.1, which is observation, engagement and supportive observation calls for empathy and engagement combined with readiness to act. It provides an opportunity for staff to interact with patient in a therapeutic way. Supportive observation can increase understanding of the feelings and motivations of the patient to act in a particular way. It can also offer the patient support and guidance in how to deal with those feelings and thoughts. And you say there's a number of reasons why patient, or it says they maybe need to be cared for or defined on higher engagement and supportive observation levels. And the document lists the risk at 4.4.2. Can we go to the next page, please? And just acknowledge this is the current document, that the next page sets out the levels of observation, and I think we need to go over the page for that to be completed. We see the 4 levels, is that right? 4 levels of observation. Beginning with general observation and moving up to level 4, which is continuous with arm's length. And then can we go to 1299, Amanda, please, and 411. While we have the document up, please. And where it goes over the page, can we see what it says about carers? It will save us getting the document. Carers are an integral part of someone's care and risk assessment. Carers will often be able to support professionals in telling them what the individual is usually like when well and how they best engage with others. This brings a key opportunity for staff to better individualise care. When the patient has given consent, the carer should be updated in a timely manner about the level of observations the patient is on and the rationale as to why. The carer should be given the opportunity to give their view on it this, the carer should also be welcome to review this level of observations with the MDT and patient themselves. And on the next page, this includes being able to discuss concerns when decisions are being made to downgrade a patient's observation levels and to have their voices heard and listened to when practically possible. In the absence of care involvement, all patients should be aware of their right to have an independent mental health advocate or an independent mental capacity advocate. In terms of agreeing observations, does this apply to all patients, including those who have just been admitted to the ward?
That's right. That's correct.
Is there a higher minimum observation level that all newly admitted patients to acute wards must be placed on?
Most of the admissions, patients would go on a level 2 observation.
What's the rationale for that?
Especially when initially the ward is under, sometimes, especially new patients, you're not aware of the clinical presentation, you're not aware, you're still in the process of gathering information, understanding the patient, and it is better to have a closer eye on the clinical presentation of the patient.
What is the trust policy or expected practice as to when and in what circumstances a decision can be taken to downgrade a patient's level of observations?
It's a clinical decision. If the staff would aim to treat patients on the lowest level of admission observation, but these decisions have to be made at a short notice quickly. If someone is becoming aggressive, either harming themselves or damaging the ward, they have to be quickly put on a higher level of observation.
My question was about downgrading.
Downgrading is again a clinical decision. If the patient no longer poses a threat to himself or others of the ward, then they would be downgraded. We expect level 3 and level 4, which is a higher level of observations for a more senior person to undertake, whereas level 2, even the nursing staff would downgrade the patient. It usually is a multidisciplinary decision, MDT decision.
I was going to ask, you say usually, does it require authorization from the MDT?
It doesn't require authorization from MDT. A consultant can make a decision and say that the patient can be downgraded to level 2 or level 3.
We've looked at
Sorry,
that.
can I just interrupt?
Yes, of course.
But level 2 and level 1 is a matter for the nursing staff, I think you said.
Or the other staff, or the junior doctor on the trainee doctor on the ward.
Sorry.
No, thank you very much, Chair, for clarifying that. We see this as the current policy. Are there any substantial differences, do you know, from previous policies?
The level of observations, the 4 levels have been the same for a long time. How it's implemented probably has changed with time. They're now, the observation earlier was just an unqualified staff sitting with the patient to make sure patient's safe. There's a now expectation that the staff interacts with the patient rather than just observe the patient. And also I think some of the observations are now on, so the observations are done on paper and just single phrase, if patient asleep or patient awake, but there's an expectation that that the staff who are undertaking the observation are engaging with the patient and making the most of that. There are e-observations now been introduced in the organisation.
I'll come back to the therapeutic engagement in a moment because it's there, but it's right to observe, I won't ask that we go back to it, that on the first page it says that in November 2023 this document had a comprehensive rewrite and it was renewed with renewed focus on engagement, lived experience contributions and leadership. So
So the durations were changed, I think, I fully don't recall, but the number of hours individual staff can or should undertake an observation was changed. The number of patients that can be observed by one particular staff was changed. So acknowledging the fatigue and some of the issues that were coming at the time of staff found sleeping on the observation. So those, I understand, led to those changes being introduced.
Therapeutic engagement is dealt with at paragraphs 221 to 242 of your statement, and we've just seen, as I say, reference to it within the document we've just looked at. How does the Trust monitor that there's been a sufficient level of therapeutic engagement in respect of the patients that have been subject to observation and restrictive practices?
It's my understanding that it's sometimes difficult to monitor. It will depend upon the patient's clinical presentation and willingness to enter a conversation or in a therapeutic activity. Patient might just want to be left alone. So it's difficult to get a qualitative aspect of how much a therapeutic interaction has been during a level of observation. It is something that is now the focus and emphasis is on making that the most of that opportunity to engage in some therapeutic activity. It will depend upon patients' involvement, engagement, and willingness as well.
Just moving on to other restrictive practices, you provide a list at 225 to 226. In terms of blanket restrictions, can you give an example of a specific justification for a blanket restriction? I appreciate that blanket restrictions are put in place often without justification as per the documentation. But can you give us an insight into how blanket restrictions were used over the relevant period?
So at one stage, when ward didn't have enough staff, they would close the doors to the garden because they didn't have staff to monitor the patients when they're going on in the garden. So that is a blanket restriction. CQC would monitor and would take an objection to that. We expect when the patients are in a garden area, they need to be observed, and if that is not there and the door is closed, that's an example of a blanket restriction. Or closed doors is another example.
So, and you say the CQC would monitor that?
CQC would monitor.
In terms of searches, you've provided the current search policy. I'm just going to move through, which I think is your MK2 30, which is at Exhibit 6, 9607 or internal 1361. It's paragraph 7.1, which says when a search can take place. There's a separate protocol for secure services, isn't there? Let's make that clear just straight away. A search can take place as part of the normal routine at the time of admission, will always take place. Personal search and personal belongings. On return from leave, including short leave, recorded in the care plan and or risk assessment. When staff suspect there is a risk to the surface user themselves or others, and that's a search of the person in search of personal property and sleeping areas. A reactive search will be based on general concerns as a result of evidence or information obtained. A reactive personal search will be based on specific information or evidence, or when secluding a service user or the service user is placed into long-term segregation. So this includes a statement that a search will always take place at the time of admission. In your experience, are there any issues with compliance?
There shouldn't be. The staff have to document all the articles and items the patient's coming to the ward with. So that would involve appropriate searches. The staff have to be aware of what are the likely items that the patient's coming with, which might be used to self-harm. So that forms a part of the routine search on admission.
It's clear from 7.2 that there are different, as we say, requirements for detained service users, and if consent is refused to a service user is detained, then staff can consider continuing the search without consent. But I think it's clear, isn't it, that consent is required from informal patients?
It is required for him. It's required for. I mean, it's good practice to take consent from any patient. There are circumstances where they might have to undertake search, even if the patient's not consenting. It's not a decision that should be taken lightly. But paid staff have responsibility of safety for that patient and for the other patients as well. If there's a likelihood that the patient is bringing something which he or she shouldn't on the ward, then they would contact the ward manager, senior person, or the consultant, and in order to ensure the safety of the person or the other patients, they would undertake that. So if the patient is refusing, that itself raises suspicion of why the patient is refusing. There would always be 2 members of staff undertake that search will be undertaken in a separate area, and a due process and procedure would be followed.
In fact, in your paragraph 67, you say if a patient doesn't provide consent and has capacity and there's sufficient information to suggest risk, consent would be gained from the consultant. How is risk determined in that situation?
It's based on patient's history. Is this someone who has, on the previous occasions during leave, brought back substances? His clinical presentation, pinpoint people indicates that person's probably taken opiates. Some information from clinical records from other patients. So there are various sources which would indicate the likelihood of patients bringing something which he or she shouldn't. So that risk assessment would be taken based on a number of factors.
Is there guidance or training for staff about that? And what constitutes sufficient information of risk?
There is a policy, and it's at that time it's a clinical decision of, how the patient is presenting, and is the patient is likely to be a risk to himself or others. They have a duty of care.
Can I ask you about physical restraint? You deal at your paragraph 227 with physical restraint, and you say that physical intervention should not be used for any longer than necessary. Are EPUT monitoring the extent to which these principles are being followed in the exercise of physical restraint, and whether it is being used for the minimum duration? Is there monitoring of that?
So there's a range. So seclusion is definitely monitored. It's because under the code of practice, and CQC monitors as well. The restraint, the other restraint, there are 4 aspects. I mean, there are various aspects, whether it is necessary, whether it's proportionate, whether it is safe, and whether it's done in a compassionate manner. The first 3 are easy to monitor. There is a DATEX form completed after each restraint. That DATEX form is reviewed by a manager. There's a restrictive practices group which would oversee the trends and analysis. The question is, how do you sort of monitor the compassion element of it? And I think that's there where this fundamentals of care initiative and increasing the number of nurses on the ward so they don't feel pressured, and the compassion fatigue element of it, and what we're doing to address that comes in. But the earlier 3 aspects are monitored, and there is a specific group that looks at the restrictive practices in the organization.
Does the monitoring include analysis of whether there's any correlation between the level of reliance on temporary or bank staff and the level of physical restraint? Or are you not able to say?
I'm not sure how a number of staff on the ward would impact on the decision to restrain or not. Decision to restrain is based on patient's clinical presentation. More number of staff on the ward doesn't mean that patient will not be restrained or should be restrained.
My question wasn't around the numbers, but around staff that are temporary or bank staff, unfamiliar.
Okay. It's about the appropriateness of the restraint. Is that what you're referring to? If they're temporary staff, they may not be. They should be a TASI trained staff on each shift. They would not undertake a restraint unless they are trained to undertake the restraint. So whether you're temporary or permanent, you need to be, even if you're permanent, you need to have that training to restrain someone.
Can I just ask you briefly about therapeutic and safe intervention de-escalation procedure? You say all staff are trained in it. Is that an EPUT policy and procedure?
It's an EPUT policy and procedure.
Has it been in place throughout the relevant period?
We can get back to you on. They would be, as far as I remember, they would be restrained, and there were training and policies and procedures around how to restrain.
How is the training provided by EPUT to its staff?
There's a tacit training that forms. It's part of that, because it starts with using non-restraint procedures, how de-escalation processes, and so forth, as bit depending on the clinical presentation. So that's part of the tacit training.
Is it face-to-face or online?
It is face-to-face.
And how is it assessed that staff members have done the training and completed the training and now able to carry it out on the ward appropriately?
It doesn't. Once trained doesn't mean that you're trained forever. I think that you need regular updates of the tacit training.
And does it include all ward staff?
It includes tacit training should be provided to all ward staff.
And you said you would get back to us as to when it was within the period. Do you think it was a similar policy, or was there the situation at NEPT and SEPT?
I remember being a trainee undergoing this training. So I'm sure in most of the, and I'm not talking about EPUT here. So tacit the training, some form of control and restraint training has been there in mental health services for a long period. The trust should be able to provide more information on the duration of these trainings, how long these trainings have been there.
Chair, I'm mindful of the time, and it may be possible to go a little bit further, although I'm not entirely sure if we will complete all of my questions, or whether this might be a convenient moment and then review and return for a short period of time at 2:00 to complete Dr. Corrale and any other matters that arise before moving to this afternoon's evidence. In terms of timing, that would still ensure we finished within the normal inquiry sitting hours.
Would it be helpful if we had a slightly shorter lunch, perhaps going back at 10 to 2? Or
certainly, if that's acceptable to others. I see nodding, and Dr. Corrale knows that he may need to be back this afternoon. So
fine. Okay. Well, we'll break now until 10 to 2.
Thank you very much, Chair.